car that takes you anywhere you want to go.
If you've got a minute, we'd like to tell you about this.
Because I love it. But when I come out here, I race to win.
If you drove like this today, you'd lose your license before you hit the second stop sign. In the 1970s, the road was wild. Seatbelts were optional, kids rode up front, and what happened behind the wheel would shock drivers today. So, how did we get here? And what were we all doing behind the wheel? There was a time when a homemade dune buggy could cruise down Main Street without so much as a raised eyebrow. All you needed was an old Volkswagen Beetle chassis, a few hours in the garage, and a wild sense of adventure. These do-it-yourself buggies were chopped, stripped, and rebuilt with bare-bones frames, zero doors, and roll cages that were more decorative than practical. People drove them right onto public highways. No seatbelts, no blinkers, just raw fun and open-air chaos. Some states even allowed them to be registered with little more than a photo and a handshake. And since emissions testing was still in its awkward teenage years, nobody cared if it smelled like you were burning old tires. It all added up to a uniquely rebellious era of backyard brilliance. Of course, modern safety regulators eventually caught on. By the time the 1980s rolled around, you needed a whole lot more than a wrench and a dream to make one of these legal. And if that sounds crazy, wait until you hear how high you could lift your truck without anyone blinking an eye. Back in the 1970s, monster trucks were not just something you saw at arena shows. They were rolling through neighborhoods like local legends. Drivers would lift their trucks sky high with no thought to rollover danger, center of gravity, or whether they could actually park the thing in their own driveway. Tires the size of bathtubs? Absolutely. No visible license plate? Who was looking? There were no limits to how high you could lift your suspension or how ridiculous your truck looked. If you needed a ladder to get in, you were doing it right. Police officers rarely pulled them over because, honestly, it was not even illegal yet. No one was worried about crash test ratings or pedestrian safety zones, and the idea of stability control was still hanging out in a notebook somewhere in Detroit. Today, height restrictions and suspension laws make sure your ride does not double as a climbing wall. But back then, the bigger the better, and the louder, the cooler. Speaking of things that would make today's DMV faint, let us talk about tractors. Yes, actual tractors, cruising down country roads without plates or papers. In the 1970s, if you lived out in the country and owned a tractor, you basically owned a car, a truck, and a parade float all in one. Tractors were not just for farms, they were the rural equivalent of a commuter vehicle. Need to get to the store? Take the tractor. Dropping by your neighbor's house 3 miles down a dirt road? Tractor again. There was no need for plates, registration, or insurance. The rules were simple. If it moved and it did not break anything, it was fair game. Authorities looked the other way because honestly, who was going to ticket the guy who also grew their corn? It was a slower time, and we mean that literally. You would see 20-mile-per-hour traffic jams with a full line of cars behind one of these beasts, and no one really minded. Today, you need plates, reflectors, and often a permit to drive a tractor even a block away from your land. But back then, tractors were as common on rural roads as pickup trucks, and a whole lot louder. Get this, in the 1970s, there was no law stopping you from turning an old school bus into your family's home on wheels. You could snag a decommissioned bus for next to nothing, rip out the seats, toss in a mattress, a couple beanbags, and maybe a stovetop, and call it a camper. No certification, no inspections, no zoning permits, just pure imagination and the scent of diesel. Families would paint them wild colors, load them with mismatched furniture, and hit the road like modern pioneers. They did not have running water. Some barely had brakes. But they were mobile, cozy, and dirt cheap. There was something kind of magical about the idea. Taking your whole life, putting it on a bus, and driving until the road ran out. Today, you would need to pass a dozen inspections just to get halfway down the street. But in the 1970s, you did not need a license to be an adventure seeker on wheels. Now, if you thought turning a school bus into a camper was daring, wait until you hear about the three-wheeled wonders that are claimed to be safer than a sedan. Three-wheeled tri-cars, were one of the stranger automotive experiments to come out of the 1970s, and somehow they were totally legal to drive on regular roads. Companies like Dale and Myers tried to pitch these oddball vehicles as the future of safe, affordable transportation. But here's the twist. They were wildly unstable. They looked like space pods, handled like shopping carts, and tipped over if you so much as looked at a corner the wrong way. Some of them were so light, 2 people could lift one side off the ground. Still, they were street legal. There were no strict safety standards for this sort of thing, and as long as it had a license plate and functioning lights, it could hit the road. The idea was to offer fuel efficiency and savings during the oil crisis, but in practice, they were more likely to cause whiplash than save gas. That did not stop eager drivers from picking them up and zooming around town like extras from a science fiction movie. Today, these vehicles have either vanished completely or landed in museums as cautionary tales. But if that sounds bizarre, just wait until we tell you about kids riding gas-powered mini-bikes down neighborhood sidewalks like it was no big deal. If you were a kid in the 1970s and you did not have a gas-powered mini-bike, were you even really living? These things were like pocket-sized motorcycles. No license required, no helmets expected, and no real supervision in sight. You would see kids as young as 10 zipping down sidewalks, through alleyways, and even across busy intersections, acting like they were in some kind of stunt show. The engines were loud, the brakes were questionable, and the safety gear was usually just a baseball cap. But nobody really cared. Parents would wave from the porch and tell them to be home by dinner. And the best part? These bikes were cheap enough that a few months of lawn mowing or paper routes could get you one. Police might stop and give a warning, but more often than not, they would just shrug and let you ride. It was pure chaos disguised as childhood freedom. Today, if you so much as start one of these in a neighborhood, someone is calling the authorities before you hit second gear. But back then, it was just how kids got around. Now imagine that same freedom, but with full-grown adults riding choppers that looked more like medieval jousting weapons than actual motorcycles. Choppers in the 1970s were not just bikes, they were statements, and the louder and longer the fork, the bolder the message. You would see motorcycles with 6-foot extended forks cruising down the highway like something out of a comic book. These things had no front brakes, almost no suspension, and about as much handling control as a brick on roller skates. But nobody cared. They looked cool. And back then, looking cool was more important than stopping safely. Builders would chop down factory models, stretch out the frames, and slap on as much chrome as humanly possible. The longer it looked, the better. Riding one meant you had guts, or just no fear of potholes. Amazingly, these were all street legal. You could register a motorcycle with modifications that today would not make it past a parking lot inspection. There were no federal mandates on motorcycle geometry or braking systems. If it ran, it rode. Eventually, the law caught up, and these extreme builds got shut down by new regulations. But at the time, choppers were everywhere, from biker rallies to small-town roads, rolling art with no regard for physics. If you think that sounds wild, wait until you picture someone doing their weekly grocery run on a riding lawnmower. Yes, you read that right. Riding lawnmowers were not just for cutting grass, they were for visiting neighbors, hitting the local store, and sometimes even school drop-offs. In smaller towns, you could hop on your mower and putter right into town, past houses, dogs, and the occasional confused police officer. Nobody batted an eye. It was slow, it was loud, and it was very much not road safe, but it was legal. You did not need registration or a license, and in some places, people just threw a flag on the back and called it good. The lawnmower became an unlikely local legend. You might pass 3 of them parked at the general store like horses at a saloon. People waved like it was completely normal because, well, it was. It was practical and resourceful, and honestly, pretty charming. Today, cities and counties have all kinds of rules about non-standard vehicles on public roads. Most riding mowers now are strictly yard-bound unless you want a ticket and a lecture. But in the 1970s, nobody had time for that. If it moved and did not catch fire, it was transportation. Speaking of creative transportation, The next thing might blow your mind, because you could legally build a car in your garage from scratch and still register it for the road. Kit cars were the adult version of a Lego set, if Legos went 70 miles per hour and could possibly explode. You would order a fiberglass body from a catalog, bolt it onto a salvaged frame from a junkyard car, and presto, you had a custom ride. There were kits styled to look like sports cars, vintage racers, or even futuristic space cruisers. No two were ever quite the same, and that was the charm. What was missing? Crash testing, emissions control, reliable seatbelts, minor stuff. Laws eventually caught on and tightened up hard. Nowadays, building a kit car is like applying for a pilot's license with extra paperwork. But in the 1970s, it was a golden age for homegrown horsepower. Yet none of these Frankenstein rides held a candle to the tank-sized beast that was the used checker cab turned personal car. If you wanted to feel indestructible in the 1970s, you bought a retired checker cab and drove it like your own private limousine. These things were built like bunkers. Steel frames, giant bench seats, enough legroom to host a yoga class. They were meant to haul passengers all day, every day, and because of that, they could take an unbelievable beating. When cities started retiring their fleets, the used cabs hit the market for dirt cheap, and everyday people scooped them up like hotcakes. You could legally register one as a personal vehicle, no questions asked. It was not unusual to see a checker cab parked in a suburban driveway, its faded yellow paint barely covered by an amateur paint job. They were impossible to miss and nearly impossible to wreck. Safety standards? They were considered built-in by sheer size and weight. Of course, they guzzled gas like nobody's business and cornered like a refrigerator on wheels, but hey, that was a small price to pay for invincibility. Eventually, they disappeared, retired for good. And speaking of unusual rides, let us not forget about the street-legal tuks and rickshaws that once rolled through American tourist towns like they belonged there. In the 1970s, tourist towns across America fell in love with the exotic charm of tuk-tuks and rickshaws, those little three-wheeled wonders that looked more at home in Bangkok than on a beachfront boulevard in Florida. But there they were, buzzing around like mosquito-sized taxis, legally driving alongside full-sized cars and trucks. Some were imported directly from Asia. Others were homemade contraptions cobbled together in backyard sheds using scooter engines and whatever metal scraps were lying around. They barely had suspension. Their top speed was a hopeful 25 miles per hour, and turning corners felt like rolling dice. But city officials thought they were charming, tourists loved them, and for a brief moment, they were as American as funnel cake. You could drive one of these with nothing more than a regular driver's license and a little bit of nerve. No airbags, no crumple zones, no real doors, and sometimes no roof either. They were part carnival ride, part cab, and somehow fully legal. Eventually, rising safety concerns and tighter import regulations shut them down on public streets, pushing them into novelty rides at festivals or private events. Still, for a while, you really could get picked up from your hotel in a tuk-tuk. And if that sounds sketchy, imagine cruising through a rainstorm in a car that did not even come with windshield wipers. Believe it or not, in the 1970s, it was possible to drive a brand new vehicle or a custom-built kit car without windshield wipers or washers. Some models, especially custom or minimalist designs, just left them out entirely. It sounds impossible today, but at the time, they were not always considered essential safety equipment. Builders prioritized style and speed over visibility and common sense. You might see a slick fiberglass roadster with chrome finishes and not a single way to clean the windshield. Drivers would keep a rag on the dashboard and physically wipe the glass at stoplights, assuming they did not just lean out the window and squint through the rain. There were even people who used Rain X or wax to repel water and called it a solution. Inspectors? Barely existed in some states. Wiper blades were seen as optional for sunny day cruisers, and if you were unlucky enough to hit a downpour, well, you just pulled over and waited it out. Nowadays, having wipers is the bare minimum requirement to get on the road, and most vehicles even have advanced washer systems with heated nozzles and speed-sensitive settings. But back then, if you were driving something custom or stripped down, You might not have even noticed they were missing until the clouds rolled in. You thought that was risky. Just wait until we get into the world of go-karts with lawnmower engines tearing up the neighborhood streets. There was a glorious time in the 1970s when the most thrilling ride in the neighborhood was not a muscle car. It was a homemade go-kart built by some kid's uncle with too much free time and a busted lawnmower engine. These things were made out of whatever metal you could find, bolted together into a barely functional frame with 4 wheels and a steering wheel that only kind of worked. Helmets? Nope. Seatbelts? Dream on? Registration? What registration? These carts were pure chaos on wheels. Kids, and sometimes fully grown adults, would rip down suburban roads, swerve into cul-de-sacs, and blast through alleyways like they were in a Mario Kart level, minus the bananas. Neighborhoods would hear the buzzing of those tiny engines and just accept that someone was probably about to crash into a mailbox. Somehow, none of this was illegal. There were no clear rules in many towns about non-road vehicles, so these go-karts slipped through the cracks. Eventually, local ordinances caught up, and you could not drive one more than a few feet without someone calling the city. But for a golden moment, they were the rebellious heart of backyard engineering. Now, if you think a go-kart was wild, let us tell you about the time people actually drove bumper cars at county fairs on real roads. Yes, this actually happened. In some parts of the country during the 1970s, bumper cars, the kind you find in carnivals and amusement parks, were converted for short street use during festivals and county fairs. Some of them were fitted with actual wheels, small engines, and minimal wiring just to make them move off the fairgrounds and into local parades. It was part stunt, part gimmick, part, what were they thinking? You would see these boxy little tanks crawling along rural roads with drivers sitting upright like theme park operators, occasionally honking a sad little horn and waving to onlookers. The safety features were non-existent. No blinkers, no headlights, no brakes worth trusting. But they were legal for the occasion because of temporary permits issued for special events. Once the fair was over, some people tried to hang on to the dream and keep driving them around their hometowns. And in a few cases, it worked, for a little while. Eventually, insurance companies, highway patrol, and basic logic stepped in. Today, these rides live in fairgrounds, collector garages, or car museum oddities. But once upon a time, you really could take one of these padded nuggets of joy out for a slow-motion cruise. Believe it or not, some of the strangest road warriors of the 1970s were full-sized vans with no windows, no back seats, and absolutely no seatbelts. If there was one vehicle that perfectly captured the weird freedom of 1970s driving culture, it was the full-sized van. These things were enormous, heavy, and often customized within an inch of their lives. The best part? You could gut the entire back, rip out the seats, add shag carpeting, mount a beanbag or two, and call it a day. No seatbelts? Totally legal. No rear windows? Who needs them? These vans were rolling fortresses with the aerodynamics of a toaster, used for everything from cross-country road trips to weekend camping to transporting band equipment, or sometimes just vibes. Families use them like mobile homes. Teenagers turn them into party lounges, and small businesses use them to haul whatever they could fit inside. They were cheap, easy to modify, and did not have to follow many rules beyond the basics. Nobody cared what was going on behind the driver's seat as long as the thing moved. Nowadays, every seat in a vehicle needs a seatbelt, and cargo vans without windows are considered commercial, not personal use. But back then, if it had 4 wheels and an engine, it was good to go. Yet, even among all that, perhaps nothing is more surprising than the fact that some cars came with no side mirrors at all. It might sound completely bizarre today, but in the 1970s, some cars rolled right off the assembly line with 0 side mirrors. That is right, none. On certain base models, especially economy cars, the passenger side mirror was considered an add-on, and sometimes even the driver's side mirror was optional. The thinking back then? Fewer mirrors meant less wind resistance, cheaper production, and hey, just turn your head. Manufacturers treated side mirrors like they were luxury features, not crucial safety tools. And while it is true that cars were smaller and slower overall, it still meant a whole lot of blind spots on roads that were just as chaotic as they are now. People drove like this for years. Adjusting your view meant craning your neck and guessing what might be zooming up behind you. It was not until later that regulations began requiring at least one side mirror by default. Today, even backup cameras are standard. But go back a few decades, and just staying in your lane required Olympic-level reflexes. And if that feels dangerous, just wait until you learn about the ex-military Jeeps folks were driving around with zero upgrades and even fewer rules. After World War II and the Vietnam War, surplus military Jeeps were sold to the public like clearance furniture. You could pick one up cheap from government auctions or local sellers, toss on a coat of paint, and boom, you had a ride. But here is the thing. These vehicles were built for war zones, not school zones. Most had no proper headlights, no turn signals, no safety belts, and definitely no emission standards. They were designed to survive enemy fire, not rush hour. Still, people loved them. They were rugged, iconic, and screamed freedom. You would see them roaring down suburban streets, sometimes with camouflage still showing, driven by folks who had no idea how old the brakes were. Some were missing doors entirely. Others had open tops with no roll cages. But back then, if you could get it to start, the government would usually give you a title. Modern regulations have cracked down hard, especially around emissions and crash safety. But if you think driving a bare-bones military Jeep was bold, wait until you meet the drivers who hit the streets in chopped-up rat rods with engines exposed and metal everywhere. Rat rods were Frankenstein's monster in car form, barely held together, loud, messy, and completely glorious. In the 1970s, these custom builds exploded in popularity with hot rodders and mechanics who were less about polish and more about raw attitude. They would tear apart old Fords and Chevys, drop in massive engines, and leave everything else hanging out in the open like a dare. These cars had jagged edges, no hoods, and often no real interiors, just a steel shell and a bucket seat. Sometimes they did not even have paint, just rust and pride. Despite their appearance, rat rods were legally registered and could be driven on public streets. Safety features, not a chance. Pedestrians gave them wide berths because even looking at one too hard felt like you might get tetanus. But they were the ultimate statement car, built not to impress but to intimidate. And in the 1970s, people respected that. Laws were loose, and inspectors were not exactly combing over every bolt. Today, street legality requires covering sharp edges, protecting exposed parts, and meeting emissions standards, which makes most rat rods strictly show-only now. And speaking of cars made to show off, you are not going to believe people once drove around with actual flamethrowers strapped to their bumpers. Yes, you read that right. Some hot rodders in the 1970s actually installed flamethrowers and smoke kits on their cars, on purpose. These were not military-grade weapons, but rather homemade or aftermarket systems that could shoot a plume of fire or a cloud of smoke from the rear end of a vehicle. Think Mad Max, but with more mullets. The flamethrowers usually worked by injecting unburnt fuel into the tailpipe, igniting it with a spark plug to create a fireball during gear shifts. Drivers would use them at car meets, drag strips, or even while pulling away from a stoplight just to impress the crowd. Smoke kits did not involve fire but added dramatic flair by pumping thick clouds of colored vapor out the back. It was loud, flashy, borderline dangerous, and somehow completely legal in most places at the time. There were no real restrictions on aftermarket modifications, and few police officers even knew what to make of it. Fast forward to today, and these gadgets are banned in most states under safety and emissions laws. But in the 1970s, they were the ultimate party trick for anyone who thought horsepower alone just was not enough. And if you think that sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie, wait until we talk about the cars that actually looked like they flew in from outer space. The Bradley GT and its fiberglass cousins were supposed to be the future of driving, but they barely handled like real cars. These so-called future cars were often sold in kit form and looked like they belonged on the set of a space opera. Sleek, low-slung bodies, canopy-style doors, and enough chrome to blind an astronaut. Built on top of Volkswagen Beetle chassis or other donor vehicles, they had no crumple zones, almost no safety testing, and interiors that were more lawn chair than luxury. But they made people feel like they were living in tomorrow. The problem? They were incredibly light, poorly insulated, and shook like a blender over 40 miles per hour. Still, drivers loved them. You could legally register them in most states, drive them around town, and bask in the oohs and ahs from strangers. Safety features were an afterthought, if they existed at all. And good luck in a crash. Fiberglass does not forgive. Eventually, insurance companies and regulators wised up. Many of these cars disappeared into garages or museums, remembered more for their looks than their performance. But in their day, they ruled the road like low-flying spaceships. And just when you think it could not get more reckless, remember when kids rode in rear-facing seats with no restraints, laughing all the way? For kids growing up in the 1970s, there was no better place to sit in a car than the rear-facing seat of a station wagon. These big, boxy rides were practically rolling living rooms, and that back seat, it was a universe of its own. You could wave at strangers behind you, make faces at other drivers, or just stretch out like you were in a mini living room on wheels. Seatbelts? Not even close. Most rear-facing seats did not have any, and if they did, good luck getting a kid to actually use one. Parents would just toss a few grocery bags next to you and call it a day. You would bounce around back there like a pinball every time the driver hit the brakes, and nobody thought twice about it. It was weirdly social, too. Siblings would argue about who got the cool seat in the back, even though it was probably the most dangerous place to sit. Fast forward to now, and the idea of putting kids in an unbelted seat facing the wrong way on a freeway feels like something out of a bad dream. But back then, it was part of the charm. And while some families were flying down the road in station wagons, others were rolling through town in something a little more rural. Converted horse carts were not just for old-timey movies. They were rolling through rural roads and parades across America in the 1970s. You would see them everywhere, from small-town celebrations to family farms on the weekend. All it took was an old wooden cart, a small tractor engine, and some farm know-how. People would mount seats, add decorative wheels, and sometimes even paint the whole thing with flags, slogans, or the occasional homemade logo. If you were lucky, it came with headlights. If not, well, you just avoided driving at night. These makeshift rides were slow, clunky, and made entirely out of repurposed materials, but they were legal. In farming communities, law enforcement usually turned a blind eye, especially if the thing did not look like it was about to fall apart. Technically, these contraptions were not cars, not tractors, and not exactly carts either. Occasionally, someone would try to drive one into town, just to pick up supplies or show off at the local diner. Today, something like this would never pass inspection, and most towns would have code enforcement on speed dial. But back then, if it moved and did not cause a traffic jam, it was good enough. And if you thought that was casual, imagine cruising through downtown traffic on a moped with zero paperwork. In the 1970s, mopeds were the loophole everyone loved. These tiny motorized two-wheelers often came with pedals, which made them look just close enough to bicycles that you could get away with a lot. No license plates, no registration, and in many states, no driver's license needed. If it had pedals and an engine that did not go over 30 miles per hour, you were basically riding under the radar. You would see mopeds parked outside schools, job sites, and downtown cafes, no parking permits required. Helmet laws? Those were still in the works. The line between motor vehicle and bicycle with ambition was as blurry as the rearview mirror, assuming you had one. These days, states have cracked down hard with registration laws, safety requirements, and licensing tiers. But during the golden era of moped madness, if you could pedal it and start it, you could drive it. And in winter towns, when mopeds disappeared, another unlikely vehicle took their place. Snowmobiles, right on the main road. When winter blanketed small towns in the 1970s, out came the snowmobiles, and not just for recreation. These snowbound machines doubled as commuter vehicles, and people rode them straight down the main road like it was no big deal. Kids would take them to school, adults would use them to get to work, and some would even haul groceries home on the back. It was faster than trudging through knee-deep snow, and in towns where roads doubled as ski trails, nobody complained. You did not need a license in many places, and registration was spotty at best. Helmets were optional. Safety gear? If you remembered gloves, you were doing well. The local police usually looked the other way, and some towns even created temporary snowmobile lanes during particularly bad winters. Today, you are more likely to get fined for just thinking about taking a snowmobile on a paved road. And as wild as all that sounds, nothing quite tops the sight of a wooden car flying down the road like it belonged there. Vehicles with homemade wooden bodies were the stuff of legend and occasional nightmares. In the 1970s, if you had enough plywood, nails, and a dream, you could build your own car shell and slap it onto an old chassis. And here is the kicker: you could register it. That is right. You could actually take your handcrafted wooden ride to the DMV and drive off with legal plates. Safety? Laughable. These cars had no real crumple zones, barely any weatherproofing, and more splinters than a lumberyard. But they moved. And in the eyes of the law back then, that was what counted. People used them for parades, for joy rides, and even as daily drivers in rural areas. Today, you would be flagged at the first inspection checkpoint and probably featured on a Do Not Drive This news segment. But during the anything goes era of car culture, wooden body vehicles were legal, memorable, and just barely hanging together. Now, how about something we used to build into the wall that flipped down like a magic trick? Get ready, because we are unfolding something special. It looked like a cabinet, just a little rectangle in the wall with a tiny knob. But open it up and suddenly you had an ironing board swinging down like a Murphy bed for your clothes. Fold-out ironing boards in the wall were the peak of space-saving genius. These things were especially popular in mid-century homes, when every inch of space had to count. The board folded out flat, usually right next to the laundry area or inside the kitchen pantry. You did not have to drag a heavy metal contraption from the closet. Just pop it open, plug in the iron, and get to work. Some even had a tiny shelf or built-in plug to hold the iron itself, along with a little light above the board. Now that was fancy. Housewives adored these because they made chores quicker. And let's face it, they just looked slick. Like the house was in on the secret with you. Eventually, though, as trends moved toward larger laundry rooms and portable everything, these ironing stations disappeared. But for the folks who grew up with one, there is a real nostalgia there. It was like opening a secret door into domestic life. Now, speaking of secret doors, the next one was not about cleaning your shirt. It was about making sure your closet smelled like the forest. Electric slimming belts were the miracle fitness gadget of the 1980s, or so the ads claimed. Wrap it around your waist, plug it in, flip the switch, and prepare to get electrocuted into peak physical form. These belts sent pulsing electric shocks into your abdomen under the promise of stimulating muscles and burning fat. What they really did? Cause skin burns, fainting spells, and enough emergency room visits to make the Food and Drug Administration step in. They buzzed, jolted, and sometimes sparked, especially if you were sweaty, which the instruction manual encouraged. You'd lie there, twitching like a frog in biology class, convinced the pain meant it was working. These devices became so notorious that many were banned or pulled from shelves by the late 1980s. Today's fitness tech might still overpromise, but at least it doesn't literally jolt you awake. Unless you miss the 1980s, in which case, wait until you see what they handed to kids in the toy aisle next. A survival knife inspired by Rambo. Because what could go wrong? When the temperatures dropped, sometimes the best way to stay warm was simply to huddle together. Whether traveling on foot or out working in the fields, sharing body heat became a quick and simple survival tactic during the Great Depression. The scarcity of resources meant that staying warm often came down to the warmth you could share with others. It may sound basic, but this method was an invaluable part of life back then. Families, friends, and neighbors didn't just rely on physical items to get by. they relied on each other. People worked hard to protect each other from the cold, even if it meant squeezing together while waiting for the bus or during a cold walk to work. In today's world, we've come a long way from bundling together for warmth. Thank goodness for heated cars and insulated jackets. However, the ingenuity of huddling for warmth during a difficult time shows us the power of simple solutions and the importance of human connection. Community, collaboration, and warmth, both literal and emotional, were key. Toy guns in the 1980s were practically indistinguishable from the real thing. Made with black plastic, realistic shapes, and even working triggers, they had the look and feel of something that should have been locked in a police evidence room. Just a solid chunk of molded chaos that turned playground games into potential panic zones. You'd see kids walking down the street brandishing these things, twirling them like action stars, and every adult in the vicinity would freeze. Police departments issued warnings. Tragic accidents occurred when officers couldn't tell if it was a toy or the real deal. But the toy industry kept churning them out, fueled by action movies, war games, and every kid's dream of being the next big hero. It wasn't until a few high-profile cases made national headlines that things finally changed. New laws came in fast, orange tips became mandatory, and ultra-realistic models were pulled from shelves. Today, toy weapons come in neon pink with Super Blaster written on the side. Speaking of dangerous things that glowed in the dark, let's talk about what used to light up your bedroom walls, Radioactive style. Glow-in-the-dark stickers in the 1980s were the ultimate bedroom accessory. Stars, moons, alien decals, you'd slap them all over your ceiling and bask in the celestial glow every night. But here's the fun part. Some of them were literally radioactive. To get that long-lasting shine, certain manufacturers used phosphorescent paint that contained trace amounts of radium or tritium, materials that should have come with a Geiger counter, not a sheet of stickers. Sure, it looked magical at bedtime, but it was emitting low levels of radiation while you slept 2 feet below it. Parents had no clue. Kids loved it. And meanwhile, your space room was quietly setting off alarm bells in a future safety inspector's mind. As awareness of radiation risks grew, these glow-in-the-dark paints were pulled off the market or reformulated with safer alternatives. But the damage? Already done in bedrooms across the country. While that glow was subtle, the next invention didn't mess around. It promised to melt fat with the power of electricity. In the harsh times of the Great Depression, nothing went to waste, including the heat. Cooking became more than just a means of feeding the family. It became an efficient way to warm the house. Families would take full advantage of the heat generated by their stoves and ovens, keeping the doors to kitchens open to let that warmth spread throughout the home. Whether it was a wood-burning stove or a gas range, the heat that came from preparing meals also served the dual purpose of helping fight off the cold. This clever use of cooking was a demonstration of resourcefulness at its best. The cooking process, often slow and steady, meant that the house stayed warm for hours as the oven or stove continued to radiate heat. It also encouraged a communal atmosphere. Families would often gather around the stove, not just for the meal, but for warmth too. It became a hub of activity and bonding, with everyone doing their part to conserve what little resources they had. In today's world of modern heating and energy efficiency, we can still learn something from this practice. Using existing resources to their fullest, even in the simplest ways, is a timeless lesson in frugality and ingenuity. When the thermometer drops and the heat is scarce, When money was scarce and firewood even scarcer, families during the Great Depression turned to whatever they could find to keep their fires burning. Necessity transformed ordinary and sometimes unusual materials into lifelines. Corn cobs, left over after the kernels were eaten, became a popular fuel source in rural areas. They burned quickly but efficiently, making them perfect for stoves and small fires. Dried animal dung, used for centuries by various cultures, was also repurposed as fuel on farms where livestock was common. Even coal scraps discarded by mining operations found a second life in the hearths of resourceful families. This was an ingenious blend of frugality and environmental adaptation. Nothing went to waste, Every bit of material was reused or repurposed. Coal scraps, for instance, were often scavenged by entire communities near mining towns. Children would gather the remnants, bringing home enough to keep their homes warm for another day. It's hard to imagine, but in those days, the phrase, "one man's trash is another man's treasure," could be taken quite literally. While burning corn cobs might not be the norm anymore, it's a reminder that even in the harshest times, people found ways to adapt and to persevere. When the Great Depression left families with little money to buy fuel, many hypercolor shirts were the 80s fashion flex you didn't ask for. Touch them and they changed color. Sweat? Changed color. Breathing too hard in class? Boom, color change. These shirts were made with thermochromic dyes that reacted to temperature, which was science speak for everyone can now see your armpit situation. They were magical for about 10 minutes and then quickly turned into an awkward middle school experiment. But the real danger was in the dye. Some hypercolor clothing was made with chemicals that caused skin irritation, allergic reactions, and, in worst-case scenarios, a rash that looked like a heat map of embarrassment. Combine that with fading colors, poor washing instructions, and mystery reactions when exposed to sunblock or deodorant, and you had a garment that fought back. Eventually, the clothing faded for good, literally and figuratively, and safety concerns helped bury the trend for a while. Still, for a few brief years, it was the coolest, most color-shifting thing you could wear until it gave you hives. If your shirt didn't leave a mark, the next toy definitely did, especially when it was supposed to be just plastic. Walk into an old house and open a closet door, and you might get hit with a smell that is oddly comforting. Woody, warm, a little spicy. That would be cedar, not a scent diffuser, not a spray. Actual cedar wood, lined across the walls of the closet from top to bottom. These cedar-lined closets were the silent guardians of America's wardrobes. They protected against moths, mildew, and musty smells. But they also added a kind of rustic luxury, like storing your clothes inside a tree trunk at a high-end cabin. The idea was simple. Cedar wood naturally repels insects, so why not turn your entire closet into a bug-proof haven? People did not just store coats in there, they kept heirlooms, wool suits, and seasonal clothes safe year-round. Some closets were fully lined, others just had a single cedar panel on one wall. Either way, it gave the whole room a spa vibe long before that was a thing. These days, you might see cedar blocks or hangers sold in stores, but entire closets made of the stuff? That has faded into the woodwork, literally. The world got synthetic, and the cedar charm became a relic. But if you think that was clever, wait until you see how people used to pass food across rooms without ever leaving their chair. Not every breakfast dish makes you stop and ask, are we brave enough for this? Deviled kidneys, a bold and flavorful classic, is one such dish. Originating in 19th century England and embraced by American households with British roots, this recipe turns humble lamb kidneys into a fiery, mustard-laced delicacy served atop crisp toast. The term deviled refers to the liberal use of spicy seasonings like mustard, cayenne pepper, and Worcestershire sauce, which were added to mask the strong, earthy flavor of the kidneys. It was a wake-up call for your taste buds. And for those wondering, yes, kidneys were a practical choice. They were affordable, protein-rich, and readily available during times when wasting any part of the animal was unthinkable. In Victorian times, deviled kidneys became a breakfast staple for the adventurous eater, often paired with tea and a stiff upper lip. Some even considered it the perfect cure for a rough morning after a late-night indulgence. After all, when your breakfast bites back, it's hard to dwell on anything else. Deviled kidneys may not top every modern brunch menu, but they remain a testament to the creativity of cooks who knew how to make the most of what they had. Spices, toast, and just a touch of daring. A survival knife modeled after Rambo was just what the 80s kids needed. These blades were mass-produced, slapped with the Sylvester Stallone brand, and sold to kids who still wore Velcro shoes. The blade, sharp enough to slice through rope. The handle, hollow, because inside was a survival kit, complete with fishing hooks, wire, matches, and sometimes even a tiny compass that barely worked. It was marketed as a tool for outdoor adventures, but in reality it was just a hunting knife that fit in a backpack. Boys would trade them, show them off at school, or use them in backyard missions where at least one kid came back bleeding. Teachers confiscated them, parents shrugged, and the companies? They sold more. Eventually, regulations tightened and most of these survival-style knives disappeared from toy shelves. But if you grew up in the 80s, chances are you or someone you knew had one stashed under their bed, next to their glow-in-the-dark ninja stars. If the knife didn't get you, the next toy might have, with a splash of liquid metal that rolled through your fingertips. Mercury-filled maze toys were the kind of item you now see in museum exhibits labeled "Why?" Small handheld games with liquid silver beads that glided through tiny plastic channels, mesmerizing, smooth, and completely toxic. You'd tilt the toy back and forth, guiding the Mercury around obstacles like a high-stakes version of Operation. No gloves, no warnings. Just you, the element responsible for Mad Hatter syndrome, and a plastic shell thin enough to crack if you dropped it. These were handed out as party favors and sold at corner stores like they were marbles or gumballs. Toddlers chewed on them. Older kids smashed them open just to play with the shimmering silver liquid inside. It wasn't until researchers started speaking out and some dishes make you stop and wonder, who came up with that name? Frog eye salad is one of those culinary curiosities. Don't worry, there are no amphibians involved. The name comes from the look of the tiny pasta used in the recipe, acini di pepe, which resemble, well, frog eyes. Nevertheless, the taste was sweet, creamy, and surprisingly refreshing. This dessert-like pasta salad became especially popular in mid-20th century America, a time when gelatin salads and quirky dishes ruled potlucks. The recipe combines cooked pasta, pineapple, mandarin oranges, whipped topping, and a custard-like mixture for that sweet, tangy flavor. Mini marshmallows are sometimes thrown in for good measure because why not? It's a little bit salad, a little bit dessert, and a whole lot of nostalgia. What makes frog eye salad stand out is its unusual mix of textures. It's chewy, fluffy, juicy, and creamy all at once. Truly a dish that keeps you guessing. And for those keeping track, it's also a shining example of how Americans have a knack for turning pantry staples into something uniquely delightful. Sometimes the most unassuming vegetables are turned into something spectacular, and parsnips are no exception. Grated, mixed into a batter, and fried to golden perfection, parsnip fritters are a delightful twist on traditional fritters often found in kitchens where creativity and thriftiness meet. With their mild, slightly sweet flavor, parsnips provide the perfect base for a savory snack or side dish. While parsnips have been enjoyed since ancient Roman times, they saw a resurgence in popularity during times of scarcity, particularly during the Great Depression, when root vegetables like parsnips were more affordable than other produce. The dish was a way to turn simple, inexpensive ingredients into something flavorful and satisfying. The beauty of parsnip fritters lies in their versatility. While they're commonly served with a sprinkle of salt or a dip in a savory sauce, some cooks even add spices like cinnamon or nutmeg for an unexpected sweetness. Whether enjoyed as a side dish, appetizer, or light snack, parsnip fritters make use of a vegetable that might otherwise be overlooked. Today, they may not be a household name, but these crispy, golden bites continue to remind us that sometimes all it takes is a little batter and some heat to turn a humble vegetable into something extraordinary. Toy helicopters in the 1980s were mechanical marvels and total mayhem. They came with battery packs, long plastic wires, and a launch mechanism that would send a spinning metal-bladed helicopter screaming through the air at top speed. These choppers weren't made of foam. They had real weight, real torque, and real potential to slice through your bangs. Every kid had the same goal: launch it as high as possible. Every adult had the same reaction: duck and cover. The metal blades would spin with enough force to cut skin, tangle in hair, or put a dent in your wood paneling. Worst part? Some came with combat attachments like pretend missiles or landing claws. because nothing screams safe fun like turning your living room into an active airspace. Stories of black eyes, forehead welts, and chipped teeth piled up fast. Eventually, manufacturers were forced to swap out metal parts for plastic, reduce power, and add so many warning labels it looked like the back of a shampoo bottle. But by then, the damage was done, literally. If your brain managed to survive the helicopter hits, good luck keeping it safe with the art supplies that followed. In the midst of freezing temperatures and limited resources, hot drinks became a staple of warmth for families during the Great Depression. Tea, coffee, and broth, simple yet effective, provided both physical warmth and emotional comfort. When the world outside was bitterly cold, these hot beverages acted as small but crucial escapes from the chill. Tea leaves, coffee grounds, and even bones or scraps of meat could be boiled down into a broth, stretching what little food families had. A steaming cup was an essential way to keep spirits up and bodies warm. The role of nature was key here. The cold winters could be harsh, but nature provided the ingredients for these drinks: the herbs for tea, the beans for coffee, and scraps that could be turned into nourishing broths. People adapted their everyday practices to make sure nothing went to waste, showing remarkable resourcefulness. Beyond the warmth they provided, hot drinks also created bonding moments. Families would gather around the stove, sharing stories and passing around mugs, finding warmth not in liquid, but in each other's company. Popper toys were supposed to bounce, not try to kill you. You remember them, those colorful half-sphere rubber domes you'd flip inside out, set on a table, and wait for the dramatic pop. They'd launch into the air, bounce off walls, and send toddlers into fits of laughter. But that laughter turned into choking sounds more often than toy companies would like to admit. The smaller ones were just the right size to lodge in a child's windpipe. No warning labels, no age recommendations, just a bin full of potential emergency visits. If it bounced under the couch, your little sibling would be the first to dive after it, and sometimes straight into a medical emergency. Parents bought them by the dozen at grocery store checkout lanes. Eventually, safety boards stepped in, issuing recalls and choking hazard warnings left and right. The toy aisle cleaned up a little. But if you grew up in the 80s, you know the truth. That little rubber dome had the soul of a landmine. And if that did not take your eye out, the next one just might, because it had actual spinning metal blades. Some dishes are all about simplicity, and coddled eggs are the perfect example. This soft cooked egg dish is made by gently submerging eggs in hot water, or sometimes using a specialized cup to coddle the egg just below boiling. The result is a delicate, slightly runny egg with a tender white and rich yolk, often served as a luxurious breakfast or a refined addition to a light meal. The term coddling comes from an Old English word meaning to pamper or to treat gently, and this process certainly lives up to the name. Unlike hard boiling, which can leave the yolk dry and chalky, coddling ensures the egg maintains its softness, making it a favorite for those who prefer a gentler approach to cooking eggs. Coddled eggs gained popularity in the 18th and 19th centuries, especially in England, where they were served to those in delicate health as an easily digestible option. Over time, they made their way into American kitchens, often paired with toast or as a topping for vegetables. Some even considered them the ultimate comfort food, offering a satisfying blend of rich flavor and velvety texture. Slap bracelets were the forbidden fruit of every 1980s classroom. One second they were straight, the next, snap, they wrapped around your wrist like a coiled snake with attitude. Covered in neon fabric, animal print, or glitter, they looked innocent enough. But underneath the fun was a thin strip of spring steel that had one job: launch at high speed and curve mid-air. The problem? That metal core wasn't exactly kid-proof. If the fabric wore down, that hidden strip turned into a razor-thin whip. Kids ended up with deep scratches, cuts, and in some cases, open wounds. Teachers confiscated them. Parents complained. Schools banned them faster than you could say, Lisa Frank. Still, the appeal was undeniable. There was something addictive about that sharp snap on your wrist, like your bracelet had a personality of its own. Toy companies tried to fix the design, adding thicker fabric and safety tabs. But by then, the damage was done, and so were dozens of kids' sleeves, wrists, and friendships. And while slap bracelets left marks on your arm, the next trend turned your living room into a slow-motion air hazard. Hidden time capsules. And if you think delivering milk through a wall sounds wild, wait until you hear about the homes that were designed for smoke. Back in the middle of the 20th century, smoking was not just accepted, it was expected, and American homes were ready for it. That is where built-in ashtray stands came in. These were not just ashtrays placed on coffee tables or countertops. No, these were recessed, often permanent fixtures embedded right into walls, armrests, and even lampstands. You could walk into a living room, and there it was, your own little designated smoke spot, classy as could be. Some were ceramic, some were chrome. A few even had lids to keep the ashes tidy. And they were everywhere, in kitchens, in bathrooms, in bedrooms. The ultimate sign of a home that was with it. Even guests had their own designated ashtrays. People took pride in them. Some were decorative, shaped like seashells or horseshoes. Others were sleek and utilitarian, and it was not just adults using them. Teens had their own, often built into the back of desks or vanities. Today, of course, the idea seems almost alien. We cover smoke detectors in foil just to cook without setting them off. But back then, these ashtrays were part of the home's soul. And when the culture shifted, they vanished fast, ripped out, tiled over, or collecting dust as relics of a time no one wants to remember, but no one can forget. But the next room? Oh, that is where the real memories were made. Think beanbags, shag carpet, and absolute chaos. Gasoline-fueled model cars were as close as a child could get to operating a flamethrower without a license. These weren't battery-powered toy cars. These were mini combustion engines, fueled by real gasoline or nitromethane that roared across driveways like demonic Hot Wheels. You'd fill the tiny tank, pull the starter cord, and hope it didn't catch fire in your hands. The engine would sputter, cough, then scream to life with the sound of a weed whacker on steroids. Once running, these things hit 30 miles per hour easy. Control was optional. You'd aim it straight, watch it veer into the neighbor's leg, and hope it didn't explode. They were hot, loud, and prone to sudden flare-ups. Burns, inhalation hazards, and flying debris were just part of the charm. Parents thought it was good engineering fun. Emergency rooms thought otherwise. Eventually, the combination of fire risk, noise complaints, and endless injury reports forced manufacturers to pivot toward electric versions. Today's RC cars run cool and quiet. But back then, if yours didn't have a trail of smoke behind it, were you even playing? And speaking of painful toys disguised as accessories, let's not forget what happened when slap bracelets started slicing through sleeves and skin. When the cold was too much to bear indoors and firewood was scarce, families in the Great Depression had a clever solution: building small fires outdoors. Whether it was in the backyard or a nearby wooded area, a well-placed fire could offer a quick escape from the chill. Families would gather around these outdoor flames to warm up, often making use of whatever scraps of wood, coal, or even old furniture they could find. The ingenuity behind this was remarkable. Instead of relying solely on indoor heating, these temporary fires provided much-needed warmth without the need for a full-blown stove or furnace. These impromptu fires were an opportunity for families to gather, share stories, and bond over the shared experience of facing adversity together. Nature played an important role here, as firewood was often gathered from fallen branches or nearby trees, reducing the need to purchase fuel. The practice of outdoor fires demonstrated a resourceful use of the environment, proving that warmth could be found from the simplest of means. Sometimes the best way to stay warm wasn't by looking inside, but by stepping outside and letting nature help you out. Breakdancing mats were the ultimate flex in the 1980s. Thin vinyl sheets with printed grids, graffiti fonts, or neon lightning bolts that promised to turn your living room into a downtown dance battle. But the reality? They were slip-and-slide death traps for anyone not named Turbo or Ozone. These mats were sold as practice zones for your windmills and headspins, but came with exactly zero grip. You'd try to bust a move and your feet would shoot out like you were skating on butter. Carpet? Too bumpy. Hardwood? Too fast. Concrete? Say goodbye to your kneecaps. Kids ended up with twisted ankles, bruised hips, and rug burns that rivaled carpet burn from summer sleepovers. Some mats would fold or ripple mid-spin, launching dancers sideways into furniture. And let's not forget the ones that came with sound effects, usually embedded electronics that broke by day 3 and left you with a $30 piece of plastic sadness. Eventually, people started using cardboard instead, because oddly enough, the trash worked better than the toy. Still, if you ever tried a headspin on one of those mats, you know exactly what it felt like to nearly break a hip before the age of 10. And while that mat just made you fall, the next invention brought literal firepower to playtime. Sometimes a meal is all about comfort, history, and making the most of what's available. Hog jowl and beans is just that. A hearty, flavorful dish that combines salt-cured pork cheek with beans, creating a meal that's both filling and rich in tradition. This dish has roots in the American South, where pork was often the primary source of meat and nothing went to waste. The hog jowl, or pork cheek, was preserved through salting, making it last longer and adding a distinctive savory depth to the dish. Hog jowl and beans became a staple for many, especially during lean times. Beans were affordable, filling, and a great source of protein, while the salty, tender pork cheek added just the right amount of flavor. In fact, the dish became synonymous with both Southern hospitality and resourcefulness, ensuring that families could stretch their food supplies without sacrificing taste. This dish has even found its way into New Year's traditions in some parts of the South, where it's believed to bring good luck and prosperity for the coming year. Maybe that's why they say eating it is like getting a taste of Southern charm, slow-cooked, full of flavor, and with a little bit of good fortune to boot. Driving was wild back then. Admit it, you kinda miss it. Tap like, drop your craziest road memory in the comments, and hit subscribe for more blasts from the past.